in these issues, okay? In these situations where we're talking about like real shit, real tangible harm done to people. People that go back and go like, well, what about this alien story? It's just like fucking lasers my brain. I consider it to be sometimes a deliberate distraction. Maybe not in this case, but it's like very frustrating. And then people always like get mad at me for sidestepping away from the important conversation. It's like it's inconsequential, it's insignificant. Okay, I just don't care. Like, unless aliens are coming down to institute a socialist revolution globally, I don't give a shit. Okay.
Me.
It's so wonderful to see both of you. Thank you for talking.
In an interview to mark their 75th wedding anniversary,
Carter
pee. Was asked what he was most proud of, and notably spoke for both of them when he answered.
Well, we're very proud of having been elected and having served as president. That's the epitome of our lives, I think. I would say that we did what we pledged to do in the campaign. We kept the peace, and we obeyed the law, and we told the truth, and we honored human rights. Those were the things that were important to me.
Mr. President, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, what do you want your legacy to be?
When Jimmy Carter was sworn in as the President of the United States in 1977, the nation was still reeling from a period of political upheaval.
I came along at a time when Americans still remembered painfully the lies told and the debacle of Watergate. I was outside Washington. I was not stigmatized by the mistakes that had been made in those previous years.
It's a long way from Plains, Georgia to Washington, D.C.
And I brought a fresh face of a peanut farmer, a working man who swore never to tell a lie or make a misleading statement.
Jimmy Carter from Georgia. I hope to be your next president.
The president and his family surprise and delight everyone by walking the parade route down Pennsylvania Avenue up to the presidential reviewing stand in front of the White House.
But winning the White House at the height of the Cold War carried extraordinary responsibility.
The system is survivable, it's verifiable.
The peanut farmer from Plains suddenly had his finger on the button to start World War III.
It's a horrifying thought. If the Soviets launched a missile attack from Soviet territory, we had 26 minutes before the missile struck New York or Washington or whatever for me to respond. And so I knew that I would have to respond, which may have resulted in a Holocaust. So I went out of my way to understand the problems of Brezhnev. I used to sit by a globe and turn it to Moscow and try to imagine how I looked out on the rest of the world with a formidable military force in NATO and tremendous challenge from China. And what would happen if the Soviets became convinced that they were in danger. Well, I tried to avoid all that, but it was a very, very terrible responsibility.
To give our own and our nation's security.
Carter took pains to keep the peace and to broker a nuclear arms deal. But when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, he rolled out a covert mission to arm Afghan resistance fighters and announced a boycott of the 1980 Olympic Games in
That's interesting. I see why you say he seems like a genuinely empathetic person. No, he's like a real fucking Christian, dude. He is. Like, this is pre-Reagan Operation Cyclone, pre-Operation Cyclone, pre-official. It's the start of the brave Mujahideen, okay? Just so you understand. And it's like a lesser known aspect of the Carter administration. It's not often talked about. I mean, foreign policy in general is just like often not talked about at all, right? Unless it's a way to justify why American intervention was a necessity.
In Moscow.
With Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I will support sending an Olympic team to Moscow.
The goal, he says, was to pressure the Soviets to reform.
I wanted to change their system of government, but I also wanted to bring the Soviet Union into the international forum. The Soviet Union, had in effect promised to honor human rights, and they had failed. But over a period of time, I think that may or may not have had an impact on Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah, I mean, look, here, we'll cover this a little bit, but when former U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski bragged about prompting the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan so that it could get its Vietnam, he was not making an empty boast. Afghanistan was the ground for one of the last Cold War battles between the United States and the Soviet Union after the Red Army rolled into the country on December 24th, 1979. For the next decade, the Soviet Union became bogged down in a guerrilla war against anti-Soviet Mujahideen. Faced with a rugged mountainous terrain and stiff resistance, the supposedly invincible Red Army was humbled, leading, according to some experts, to the empire's collapse. And it certainly did, okay? The Soviet involvement in Afghanistan absolutely played a formative role in the collapse of the USSR, okay? And many years after the fact, Brzezinski openly, before 9/11, openly touted his foreign policy bona fides and said that this was a deliberate attempt to radicalize a lot of the otherwise nascent movements of the Mujahideen on the ground in an effort to destabilize the USSR adjacent Afghan government, forcing the USSR's hand into direct involvement, turning Afghanistan into the USSR's own Vietnam. Those were his words. Observers give a number of reasons for the Soviet invasion. Until 1973, Afghanistan was a monarchy led by King Mohammad Zahir Shah before he was overthrown by his cousin Mohammed Daoud, whose party consisted of pro-communist elements. Daoud was overthrown by the Afghan communists. Internal struggles among the communists led to another coup in which Hafizullah Amin took the reins of power. According to experts, the Soviets perceived Amin as a potential Tito. He was in touch with both China and the United States, and the Soviets saw Afghanistan slipping out of its orbit. According to former CIA Director Robert Gates, U.S. intelligence services began aiding the anti-Soviet Union Mujahideen 6 months ahead of the Red Army's invasion. Brzezinski said he convinced Carter to sign the first directive for secret aid to opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul on July 3rd, 1979, in an effort to goad the Red Army into invading in a 1998 interview. Obviously, we have the hindsight of 2020, but most of the Mujahideen became reactionary Islamist Taliban. But was Carter supposed to just be silent when the Soviet Union committed a genocide? More people died in the Soviet invasion than the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan combined? Wait, what? This is before. What are you talking about? About 2/3 of the Afghan population was displaced or killed. No, you're not wrong. It was fucking brutal, but you have to understand that this is before this happened. You understand that, right? Like, this is before the USSR invasion. What are you? I don't understand how you don't get that. I'm talking about the Soviet-Afghan war. There were more internally, externally displaced and killed than both U.S. interventions. Okay, but we're not talking about. I'm confused. Have you already covered this 1800 stuff? Yes. I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention, said Brzezinski. The former National Security Advisor's plan was a success. The Afghan quagmire forced the Soviet Union to stay in the Central Asian state for a decade. The initial thrust of the Soviet invasion was made by some 40,000 troops. By late 1985, this number swelled to 118,000, of which 10,000 were reported to be in the Soviet secret police and other special units to try to face down the Afghan resistance. 2 days after the Soviet invasion, Brzezinski sent a memo to the U.S. president expressing concern that if the Soviets succeed in Afghanistan, the age-long dream of Moscow to have direct access to the Indian Ocean will have been fulfilled. Virtually every intervention that happened in the Cold War era, from Afghanistan to Korea, in the post-World War II Cold War era, all the way until the dissolution of the USSR, virtually every single foreign intervention that America conducted was done in incredibly violent ways to directly destabilize these nations and punish them for the crime of having Soviet sympathies. Okay? In many circumstances, the people that were killed in this process, sometimes due to the incompetence of the Soviet-aligned governments, and incompetence born out of the fears of being destabilized, and oftentimes, more frequently than that, the direct violence of the American-aligned puppet states that were beefed up and defended by, sometimes, like in the case of Korea, direct American military action, okay, has led to countless instances of straightforward, not ethnic cleansing, but at least like ideologically cleansing the population. If you look at places like Indonesia, the numbers are in not even the tens of thousands, not even the hundreds of thousands, but almost 1 million. I think more than 1 million, as a matter of fact. And in Korea, it's tens of thousands before the Korean War. So these guys, like the things that the American aligned governments did are endlessly inhumane. And the reasons as to why they did it was because they did not want, no matter what, they did not want any sort of USSR involvement, any sort of soft power initiatives that still are in place in the new Cold War that we're currently experiencing against China. Now, you can look at that situation and be like, well, look at the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, which is true. That is something worthy of much criticism, right? Oh, they're implementing a cultural genocide against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. How dare you refuse to reckon with that reality? Okay? I do not hide that. I do not, act like that's not a real thing that's happening. I have talked about this many times over. Having said that, however, like, think about that within the context of what is also ongoing with our foreign allies, an extension of the United States of American empire, Israel, and what Israel is doing in Gaza. Okay? But Harrison said the Soviet Union was never scheming towards the Indian Ocean, adding Brzezinski promoted confrontation between Washington and Moscow in the Afghan arena. Brzezinski's hardline policy towards the Soviet Union was reflected in his policy towards Afghanistan. Over the 10 years, the CIA pumped some $2 billion of aid, weapons, and logistical support to the Mujahideen, who fervently believed they were fighting a jihad. Washington was using resistance groups for its own anti-Soviet purposes, said Selig Harrison, South Asia expert at Washington-based Center for International Policy. Brzezinski knew that a communist country's invasion of a Muslim state would raise the hackles of the Muslim world. In a memo to former President Carter, the National Security Advisor said, Muslim countries will be concerned and we might be in a position to exploit this. Yeah, this is Mika Brzezinski's father, by the way, ironically, for those of you who do not know. Morning Joe, Mika, that's who this man is. The Mujahideen put up fierce resistance. They employed guerrilla tactics against the Soviets by launching successful raids before disappearing into the numerous caves tucked into Afghanistan's many mountains. The majority of aid from Washington went to the faction led by strongman Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan Robert Newman described as an extremist and a very violent man. In 1987, the United States provided handheld Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to the resistance fighters. With these deadly missiles, the Mujahideen shot down Soviet planes and helicopters daily. Following the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, some elements of the Mujahideen evolved into groups Washington today includes in its so-called war against terror, including the Taliban. The blowback effect is quite far-flung, said Harrison. We still have Stinger missiles turning up in strange places, he added. While it seemed like a good idea at the time to provide Mujahideen with CIA training, funding, equipment, Afghanistan evolved into a breeding ground for Islamist groups, which had little love for the U.S. either. Most prominent figure to rise from Afghanistan is Osama bin Laden, leader of the Al-Qaeda group, accused by Washington of masterminding the September 11th attacks in New York and Washington. The CIA followed a myopic, short-sighted policy in Afghanistan by focusing its energies on only trying to make it hot for the Soviets and disregarding the agendas of groups it supported, said Harrison. These groups were using CIA aid to fight the Soviets to prepare for the day to fight the United States, he said. When asked if he regretted supporting these factions to fight the Soviets, Brzezinski replied, and this is in 1998, by the way, an interview that he gave boasting about his involvement, goading the USSR to invade Afghanistan because it would lead inevitably to its own version of Vietnam. He said, pre 9/11, he said, what's more important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? A statement that would haunt him, even though, of course, not many people bring this up, with the exception of the likes of people like myself and maybe the Blowback podcast. But for those who know, this was damning for Brzezinski, considering that he very openly showed the short-sighted nature of American intervention, overlooking the concept of blowback. From the onset of the invasion, the United States had no genuine concerns for the problems of the Central Asian state, said Harrison. When Washington was satisfied it had beaten the Soviets, it turned its back on Afghanistan and allowed the country to slide into turmoil. I won't say what current Eastern European nation is experiencing similarities. This time, there is no ideological component associated with it, and it's a pure irredentist versus imperialist battle. Okay? I just won't say anything. So, is it really short-sighted policy if you know you can use blowback as a consent manufacturing for future interventions? It is short-sighted policy if you personally think you can evade a blowback and at least like shelter Americans domestically from the potential consequences, or at least greatly limit those consequences. Because 3,000 dead Americans in the heart of empire is still a striking blow. Okay? Like, taking advantage of that chaos is one thing, which, of course, the American government did. But it's short-sighted because no government, no competent government, no fucking real, no real government wants their own citizens to get this devastating fucking blow. Bold of you to think the imperial oligarchs care about dead civilians that aren't their own immediate family. Anyway, here's from Mondo Weiss, Jimmy Carter's Palestine legacy. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who died on Sunday at the age of 100, is a man whose legacy will be forever inextricably linked to Israel and Palestine. Yet that legacy will be built as much on myth as on reality, with so many other aspects of the history and the politics of the, in air quotes, Holy Land. Carter is remembered fondly by many on the left, and for good reason. In many areas, he tried to govern with humanity, decency, and with regard to people's rights. Counterpunch wrote a Jimmy Carter, the False Savior article, which I think is probably pretty good as well. He was not always successful, as citizens of Cambodia and East Timor can attest. Still, if he was far from perfect, Carter did still bring principles of human rights into his policy thinking more than any other U.S. president in living memory, and quite possibly in all of American history. Is he part of why you hate Poland? What? No. There can be little doubt that Carter's heart was in the right place when it came to his ambition to resolve what he referred to as the Israel-Palestine conflict. Carter spoke often about the need for Palestinian rights to be recognized, but he also repeatedly noted that he was motivated by his affection for Israel and his desire to see it survive, something he did not believe it could do if it continued to oppress the Palestinians. Now, I need you guys to understand something. When we talk about American intervention in the region, specifically this resource-rich region that has been constantly undermined by Western powers, all the way back with colonies, and then further destabilized by American intervention, if you consistently find yourself wondering, why the fuck are so many of these countries run by guys who are fundamentalists, run by guys who are declared radicals, run by guys who have a real hatred for the United States of America? Where is that hatred born out of? Why are these people so, in your opinion, backwards? American intervention plays a very big role in this process, all the way from the Iranian Revolution down to the Taliban control of Afghanistan. And it is a story that repeats itself time and time again. Okay? Western powers have consistently seen fundamentalist interpretations of Islam, from Wahhabists all the way to the modern Salafist movements that now even control Syria as well, which has been fine for the time being in the interim period so far, okay, as a successful counterbalance against the much more damaging and the much scarier version of events, which would be secular socialist movements that declare natural resources to belong to the people, movements that actually harm corporate interests, foreign interests in these nations. You prop these guys up and you think, well, we're allies, we're aligned right now. We are aligned against the scary Soviet intervention, the scary socialist attitudes that people have. I'm broadly a USSR sympathizer, but the Afghan war was just reprehensible. Dude, I'm not defending the USSR intervention in Afghanistan. What don't you understand? Yes, it was an unimaginably bloody affair. What are you talking about? Unbelievable bloodshed, and they even toppled the existing secular socialist regime in Afghanistan. Also, the secular socialist regime in Afghanistan was fucking butchering the Muslims too. It's not like the secular socialist regime in Afghanistan was doing great things either. Okay? They were murking people in mosques and shit. Like, what are you talking about? They were clearing out villages. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I place way more blame on the cultivation of reactionary sentiments / the Taliban to the USSR as opposed to just U.S. funding. Blowback is very real, but what would you have done if you were in a position of power? Okay. My point, couldn't one say that the decision by U.S. to intervene in Afghanistan eventually led to 9/11? Yes, that is what I say. I say that all the time. That is what many scholars also say. It's called blowback. That is what this is. It's one of the greatest examples of blowback because it's one of the few instances where blowback actually came back to the heart of empire. Oftentimes, blowback comes in the form of the Iranian Revolution, right? You undermine and overthrow the democratically elected social democratic regime, right? And you put forth a monarch that is brutal and bloody, and inevitably the people say fuck you, and the groups that come out of that, the groups that come out of that successfully, that end up toppling that Shah regime, are sometimes more radical elements, more fundamentalist elements. Okay? That is the story of Iran. But if we are to talk about Afghanistan, yeah, there is an inevitability there. If you fund fundamentalist groups because they're anti-Soviet, and you still consistently intervene in the affairs of the region, inevitably the guns and the training that you gave them will be turned on you. Is your opinion based entirely on hindsight? I like that an accurate interpretation of American intervention in the Middle East and a retelling of events is considered hindsight. Yeah, of course it's hindsight. The fuck are you talking about? Yeah, dude, it's called learning history, which is what we're doing right now in this moment. Like what? Learning about historical events that led to fundamentalist groups seizing power in many different countries, okay, is one thing. Applying that understanding of interventionist policies and that end up damaging both the nation state that you are dealing with and destabilizing, and even sometimes having that harm come back domestically and harming the domestic population, and applying that to modern day events is just foresight. It turns into hindsight, turns into foresight in that regard. History does not repeat, but it often rhymes, as the classic take, right? That's kind of the reason why we learn about these things, I think, with the hopes that we don't repeat those mistakes of the past. In terms of you just called Monday Morning Quarterback for talking about history. I know. Now, in terms of what was Carter supposed to do? He's just a little baby. Do you think that Carter's administration was the first time America had engaged in this kind of intervention? Do you forget that the president prior had already done a whole bunch of this stuff as well? It's like saying, what is Biden supposed to do? What is Biden supposed to do? I don't understand. He's just a little baby. Okay, well, maybe he can read some fucking history. Okay? Do you understand? Perhaps, instead of saying, what was Carter supposed to do, which is a rinse and repeat of, well, what is Clinton supposed to do? What is George W. Bush supposed to do? What is Obama supposed to do? What is Biden supposed to do? What is Trump supposed to do? You recognize that if you have the capacity to understand American intervention and its damaging consequences, both on foreign soil and also how those damaging consequences can impact the entire globe, especially as we're past the point of 2 decades on America's war on terror, right? Something that even the broadest majorities of the American domestic population understand was a massive fucking failure and destabilized the entire globe, not just that region, but destabilized Europe and destabilized America as well. Implemented a surveillance state, basically openly legitimized a surveillance state that was already in existence. We can just look at these events and go, maybe these aren't mistakes. Maybe these are deliberate attempts. If you can comprehend this, so neutralizing the USSR at the moment wasn't the right action? Fuck no. Fuck no, it wasn't the right action. What are we talking about? Of course it wasn't the right action. What? Stalin's domestic mistakes aside, okay? his initial attempts at normalizing relations with the West was immediately cast aside time and time and time again. Okay? What are we talking about? Like, this is circa Carter, obviously. We're now talking about post-World War II American intervention at a time when the USSR has incurred tremendous penalties for successfully ridding the world of the Nazi scourge. 20 million plus dead. Many 18 to 35-year-old men, but also women and children as well in the process. And America, which was relatively unscathed in comparison to the entirety of Europe and all of the other areas that were impacted tremendously worse by World War II, was able to take advantage of that situation and immediately work to counter what they perceived is the greater threat, a much larger threat than Nazi Germany. The rise of ideological commitments to the people that worked to liberate the world of Nazi violence, of fascist violence. It was always a far bigger threat. Carter had and often expressed boundless sympathy for the Jewish people and what they had endured throughout history, but he recognized both that this history did not justify the oppression of another people and that establishing an ethnocentric apartheid state would not end the scourge of anti-Semitism or the harm that caused the Jews. This was the ethos he expressed in his book, even while it was less visible in his policies as president. Carter's view of the issue was inevitably shaped by his evangelical Christian background. This is also written about extensively. Like, his original interpretation of the situation was like, oh, it's the Holy Land. I don't know anything about this, but I just know that it's like a holy land. I'll tell you this much, by the way. Going back to the Red Scare and the war and the war against the Soviet Union, okay? Many Europeans that are in this chat feel a certain way about the USSR historically, and many Americans do as well. There's this underlying resentment, tremendous amount of resentment, okay? Oftentimes, it's not for the internal affairs of the USSR, but what they've learned in history books from, obviously, the Red Scare era remnants of anti-socialist sentiment. What they fail to recognize is that that sentiment is carried over in American politics in tremendously damaging ways, okay? Nixon famously ran on anti-communist sentiment, where he said, and this is from Blowback Season 3, the welfare state, social safety nets, or straightforward communism, these are all the same. So if you're wondering as an American, why don't we have healthcare in this country? Why is there such a why does for-profit healthcare insurance companies devastate the American population in broad fucking daylight with seemingly no intervention or no government action taken against them? Okay? Part of that is because of the undying loyalty that Americans have to defending anti-socialist sentiment. Okay? That's it. That's it. So it has a capacity to harm you directly while you are still advocating for your own demise in this way. It's interesting dynamic, but I hope people can understand it. Anyway, let's continue. Carter's view on Israel was inevitably shaped by his evangelical Christian background and his thorough immersion in the view of Israel that dominated the United States through the Cold War after World War II. It was a view that few Palestinians would recognize, but it was also a view that in the 1970s and 1980s was still more critical of Israeli actions than the overwhelming majority of Americans. Carter's view evolved over the years, as we can see from two major points of Carter's engagement with the issue: the Camp David Agreement and Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty of 1978 and 1979, respectively, and the publication of his controversial book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, in 2006. I had the privilege of meeting Carter, says the Monowise writer, a few years before his book was published. The meeting was attended by about half a dozen progressive leaders in the San Francisco Bay Area. The most striking thing I recall, aside from the oppressive feeling his Secret Service guards projected, was the depth of his feeling when we talked about both Jewish history and the Palestinian present at that time. I've met many political leaders, and I'm used to the air of phoniness they project. There was none of that with Carter. If he wasn't genuinely affected by the suffering he was talking about, he was a much better actor than he ever was a politician. This is why I said I think he is a genuinely decent person who did, as the leader of empire, unimaginably indecent things. Okay? That's why he is one of the more unique presidents. Because most presidents are fucking awful demons, both in their time in office and also certainly awful demons post-presidency. Okay? They don't even have they don't even do the bare minimum of trying to clear up some of the mismanagement that they engaged in, the deliberate death and destruction that they pushed for. EU has this context, yet they don't like the USSR. Why? For example, EU countries make fun of us for non-socialized healthcare, etc. So what's their reason for hating the USSR? Is the EU just full of Nazis? I would say that this is an entire, virtually a century of anti-socialist and anti-communist propaganda in a similar vein, with both within the EU as well as the United States of America, oftentimes backed by the United States of America. What do you think? In the immediate aftermath of World War II, when French people were asked who was most responsible for liberating Europe from Nazis, the overwhelming majority said that it was the USSR. I believe in 2002 or 2012, there was a similar study conducted. The overwhelming majority said it was America that liberated Europe from the Nazis. How do you think that happened? Here's the poll. Americans, French, and Germans give America credit for Nazism's defeat. It was early 2000s, I believe, after decades of American World War II propaganda. Yeah. France has changed its tune on American and Russians in World War II. Who do you think played the most important role in defeating the Nazis during World War II? 57% in 1945 said the Russians, the USSR. In 2018, 56% say it was the Americans, and only 15% say the USSR. So how did that happen? How? soft power, Marshall Plan, NATO, Operation Gladio, and the bounties of the complete and utter defeat of the Soviets in the aftermath of the Cold War. And the propaganda that played a formative role in justifying the American position, the capitalist position. Because this isn't just about America, this is about global capitalism. Here is what is known as the Truman Doctrine. In this tense international atmosphere, U.S. President Harry S. Truman broke with the policy of his predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and redefined the country's foreign policy guidelines. On the 12th of March, 1947, in a speech to the U.S. Congress, the president presented his doctrine of containment, which aimed to provide financial and military aid to the countries threatened by Soviet expansion. Clearly aimed at stopping the spread of communism, the Truman Doctrine positioned the United States as the defender of a free world in the face of Soviet aggression. An aid package of around $400 million was granted to Greece and Turkey. This new doctrine provided a legitimate basis for the United States activism during the Cold War. Applying the doctrine of containment, the Americans encouraged Turkey to resist Soviet claims to rights over naval bases in the Bosphorus. They also secured the withdrawal of Russian troops from Iran. In the meantime, since March 1947, efforts to crack down on Soviet espionage had been coordinated, and the United States set up its Central Intelligence Agency. These changes to external policy marked a real turnaround in the history of the United States, which had previously remained on the sidelines of European disputes. For the U.S., isolationism was no longer an option. If you are geopolitically positioned away from the greater violence that the civilian population was subjected to during World War II, and you now had an economic engine that was supercharged within the war economy, you could take advantage of the destabilization to continue the ideological capitalist domination around the globe. I agree the USSR lost 25 million to defeat fascism, and the US did all they could to thwart the admirable Soviet mission to spread global socialism, but we can't just infantilize a superpower, and the majority of U.S. funding of Mujahideen was after the USSR invasion. 1.3 million killed and 7 million displaced out of a population of 12 million. Do we just remain silent when the USSR was committing a genocide? No, but I don't think you understand. One, I'm not saying, I've never, ever said that the USSR invasion of Afghanistan was good, okay? I'm talking about how we arrive at that position. I don't know why you fail to comprehend that. I don't know why you think this is like some secret apologia that I'm engaging in. It was bad for multiple reasons, okay? First and foremost, the death and devastation of the civilian population, the displacement and the destabilization that took place. There is no infantilization there at all. It also led to the end of the USSR. I don't know. I don't know why you keep repeating this over and over again. Yes, it is a massive failure on all fronts. I don't think it's that. It's just that I don't know what I would have done if I was in a position of power. Okay. Well, if you can place yourself in the mind of Carter and the Carter administration, okay, you can maybe place yourself in the mind of the USSR as well. Like, oh, what do you do? What kind of intervention do you engage in? This kind of thought experiment allows you to literally justify, and being anti-Soviet was objectively a good thing in that specific conflict, in my opinion. This kind of opinion will cause you to end up defending the actions of either government. I'm not doing that at all. Anyway, going back to Carter, though, because we're jumping on a bunch of different talking points here. Carter spoke with pride of the work he put in with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat to the agreement at Camp David, with the immense regret that he didn't do more to secure a better future for the Palestinian people. One can debate the politics and strategy of his actions and even find considerable fault with them, but it is clear that his intentions towards both people were positive. Carter was seen by much of the Jewish community and many other supporters of Israel as an enemy, the man who forced the then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to accept compromises that he and the pro-Israel community wished to reject. But as it played out, Carter did more for Israel's security than any other U.S. president, while unwittingly setting the stage for the steady erosion of Palestinian rights that the Oslo process represented. The result of the Camp David summit and the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement that emerged from it was that Israel has not faced a credible military threat since the agreement was put in place. Carter understood, as any observer would, that if Israel made peace with Egypt, it would remove the single biggest military challenger in the region, and the remaining Arab states would no longer be able to mount a credible threat against Israel. He understood as well that by bringing Egypt firmly into the United States' sphere of influence, the Cold War balance of power in the Middle East shifted significantly. Carter, in that case, acted not only in the interests of Israel, but also to clear American interests in the outcome. The regime of annual aid that has flowed ever since to both Israel and Egypt locked both countries into an alliance and into a certain degree of dependence on the U.S., a factor that was of great importance in Cold War strategy. All of this was lost on Israel supporters in the United States. In his book, We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel, historian Eric Alterman described the reaction to Carter mentioning the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, citing Carter's press secretary Jody Powell describing the reaction as bonkers. Alterman elaborated. Democratic fundraising events were canceled. Representatives of the administration of Jewish groups were shunned. Hyman Bookbinder, the outspokenly liberal Washington representative of the American Jewish community, lectured the Carter people. Obviously, you do not really understand what these words mean. Palestinian rights means the destruction of Israel. A Harris poll taken at the time found 60% of Jews agreeing with the statement that the president and his people have abandoned Israel. A statement that you have heard time and time again, as a matter of fact. Obviously, you apparently do not really understand what these words mean. Palestinian rights are direct odds, at direct odds with the rights of the Israeli public. Palestinian rights is a substitute for the death and destruction of the nation state of Israel. You understand? Alterman further noted that the chairman of the Conference of Presidents' major Jewish organizations at the time, Alexander Schindler, leaked the contents of a private meeting with Carter to the press, a highly unusual betrayal of trust. That generated even more intense controversy and American Jewish anger at Carter, as it was intended to do. All of this, it must be noted, was in response to Carter's vision of Palestine being a sort of autonomous adjunct of Jordan, a position not far removed from that of most of the Israeli political spectrum. He was not advocating for an independent Palestinian state, an idea which was completely out of bounds in American political discourse in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Indeed, Carter in March 1977 said, the first prerequisite of a lasting peace is the recognition of Israel by her neighbors. Israel's right to exist, Israel's right to exist permanently. Carter never wavered from that position, despite the invective hurled at him by Israelis and Israel's American boosters for the rest of his life. When the historic agreement emerged from Camp David, parts of the Jewish community saw Carter in a better light. But this soon faded amid controversy over the sale of fighter jets to Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Jewish leadership got even more enraged when, due to a miscommunication, the U.S. voted in favor of a Security Council resolution that condemned Israeli settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Though Carter said that the U.S. was supposed to abstain and only voted yes by mistake, which marks one of the few instances where the American government officially sided against Israel, a mistake that they never repeated, mind you. It was quite controversial. I need to add so I remember to sub. I need to add so I remember to sub. Okay. Here's your reminder. At the top of the hour, we no longer run ads, but you should be reminded right now to subscribe, which you can do for $6 or for free with a Twitch Prime. Twitch Prime is free. You can also get gifted a sub. When you subscribe, you support the broadcast and the many initiatives that I engage with, but also maintain my editorial independence, and you can send me links. It's completely voluntary. If you don't feel the need to do so, you don't have to, but just a reminder. General Justinian, thank you for the 5 gifted subs. Baja Blast My Brains Out, thank you for the 10. Virtual Meal, thank you for the 10 gifted subs as well. Wrong, they are discounted, chat, at $4.50 right now. Indy K, thank you for the 5. And Throwing Bagels at the Wall, thank you for the 10 community gifted subs. Though Carter said the U.S. was supposed to abstain and only voted yes by mistake, the Jewish leadership already hostile to him was not mollified. It was worth noting, however, that at the time opposition to settlements was much stronger U.S. policy, so much so that even the staunchest pro-Israel advocates didn't expect the U.S. to vote no on the resolution. Times have certainly changed. While the Jewish community was nowhere near large or powerful enough to cause the defeat of an incumbent president, it was a factor in Edward Kennedy's strong, if ultimately unsuccessful, challenge for the Democratic nomination in 1980, which weakened Carter. Carter had the poorest showing among Jews any Democratic presidential candidate had since 1920. Although he still won the plurality of the vote, John Anderson, who ran as an independent, got 15% of the Jewish vote, the Carter's 45%, and Ronald Reagan's 39%. Yet after all of that, and with some continued grumbling and foot stomping, Israel did manage to make peace with Egypt, withdraw its settlements from the Sinai Peninsula, secure the annual funding that has stabilized and grown its economy, and helped it become the dominant military power in the region, and kept Egypt as a cold ally ever since. Israel has Jimmy Carter to thank for all of that. So while many people talk about the successful initiatives of Camp David, from the perspective of Palestinian emancipation, it was a major setback, and it completely pacified one of the vectors of pressure against the state of Israel. It also opened up Israel's control over the Suez Canal, or potential control over not just the Red Sea trade ports, but it left it in the hands of an American client state, a state that became an American client state in the aftermath of this. Reagan did little but press forward on Carter's actions until the end of his second term. Ironically, Reagan would, only a few months later after taking office, have his own run-ins with Israel's domestic U.S. lobby over the sale of the airborne warning and control system to Saudi Arabia. Yet Reagan remained beloved among the pro-Israel forces despite selling a state-of-the-art military system to the Saudis, whom Israel was still extremely unfriendly with at that point, despite its frequent criticism of Israel's behavior in Lebanon, and despite rebuking Israel for its dangerous attacks on a Sirak nuclear site in Iraq in 1981. The difference was that Reagan rarely mentioned the Palestinians and often said nice things about Israel. Now, famously, the video of Jimmy Carter talking to journalist Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! In 2007 is a video that has been circulated quite a lot since his untimely demise. In this interview, which we showed earlier, which we showed yesterday, Jimmy Carter said, the word apartheid is exactly accurate. In 2007, he said this. Within Palestinian territory, they are absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is The other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other, and the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people. Carter was responding to the resounding criticism of his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. The book itself was far less remarkable than the title, which drew an avalanche of criticism to Carter, including accusations of anti-Semitism. Then ADL leader Abraham Foxman said, the title is to delegitimize Israel, because if Israel is like South Africa, it doesn't really deserve to be a democratic state. He is provoking, he's outrageous, and he's bigoted. But perhaps most damningly, he was correct. Foxman's statement is bizarre. States, of course, do not deserve to be democratic. It is something that they either are to a significant degree or they are not. Foxman could not even utter the possibility that Israel was not a democratic state, which interestingly was certainly not what Carter was saying either in his book or in his subsequent statements and writing. Carter was trying to warn Israel that it would become an apartheid state if it didn't change course. This stood in sharp contrast to the claims of Palestinians who by 2007 had already been accusing Israel of apartheid for many years. Worse for Foxman was that Carter made the argument that legitimate Palestinian views were rarely heard in the media, although Carter neither stated nor even implied that this demonstrable statement of fact had anything to do with the nefarious conspiracy of Jewish control. Foxman said the reason it gives for this, for why he wrote this book is the shameful canard that the Jews control the debate in this country, especially when it comes to the media. Anytime I talk about Israel's influence or involvement in domestic American political affairs, the same exact organizations and the same exact sentiment rears its ugly head. This conflation between Judaism and Israel, this false conflation, has existed in perpetuity. It plays a formative role in legitimizing nascent anti-Semitic opinions that people have. And yet, nothing changes. Just something to think about. Carter knew he was going to get hit for the title of his book. The substance, however, made it clear that he was trying to steer Israel away from its own self-immolation. Ironically enough, many Israeli leaders have made similar assessments. As recently as a couple months ago, a former defense minister of Benjamin Netanyahu himself said identical things. Interesting. The bottom line is this: peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when the Israeli government is willing to comply with international law. It will be a tragedy for the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the world if peace is rejected and a system of oppression, apartheid, and sustained violence is permitted to prevail. The woman in Joe Biden's administration who currently and undeservedly holds the position of special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, said Carter's book ignores a legacy of mistreatment, expulsion, and murder committed against Jews. It trivializes the murder of Israelis. Now, facing a storm of criticism, he has relied on anti-Semitic stereotypes in defense. The scurrilous accusation is backed up with the same sleight of hand Foxman used. Carter continued to advocate for Palestinian rights while also, contrary to the assertion Lipstadt and Foxman, repeatedly asserting that Israel must be afforded a secure existence within recognized and clear borders. In November 2016, as Barack Obama was preparing to leave office, Carter urged the outgoing president to recognize a Palestinian state, arguing the combined weight of the United States recognition, UN membership, and a Security Council resolution solidly grounded in international law would lay the foundation for a future diplomacy. These steps would bolster moderate Palestinian leadership while sending a clear assurance to the Israeli public of the worldwide recognition of Israel and its security. It was not the first time he had promoted such recognition. To which Barack Obama responded with, "I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Did you say give $38 billion to Israel? Because that's what I'm going to do instead." And that's precisely what Barack Obama did. A man who was friends with both Rashid Khalidi and Edward Said, mind you. A man who is still considered Barack Hussein Obama, as the number one Jew hater president in the eyes of many of Israel's staunchest supporters. This was the theme of Carter's efforts from the 1970s to the end of his days. He was willing to take risks to see that vision come true. Over the years, he and the Carter Center, made many efforts to heal the breach between Fatah and Hamas, ignoring criticism over talking with Hamas. Carter's legacy should be scrutinized carefully and honestly with the same critical eye as any other president. He made his mistakes, and as with any president, innocent people suffered as a result. But more than any other U.S. president, Jimmy Carter tried to create a better future for Palestinians and for Israeli Jews. No president before or since has tried as hard or has placed peace ahead of political concerns to the extent that he did, which is why I say Jimmy Carter, while in his own personal affairs, in his own personal conduct, in his own personal experience, especially in his post presidential existence, was definitely a man who tried to do right. Having said that, however, we will go back to the many awful things that he did during his tenure. And for that, we must go to the Counterpunch video. And this is only on foreign policy. We've yet to factor in the Jimmy Carter administration bringing about the neoliberal era that will end up destroying contemporary American existence, something that haunts every single one of you in very meaningful and very tangible ways. Anytime you think about why certain things just suck, remember that the devil himself, Ronald 666 Reagan, was probably responsible for it. But it wasn't Ronald Reagan that kickstarted this process. Jimmy Carter also played a formative role in neoliberalism taking root in American society. Counterpunch starts off by talking about having run as a Washington outsider. He immediately filled his administration with trilateral commission members, hoping that a coterie of Rockefeller internationalists could resurrect the confidence of American leaders and enrich business relationships within Japan and the United States. His Secretary of State was Cyrus Vance, a Wall Street lawyer and former planner of the Vietnam slaughter. Secretary of Defense Harold Brown was Lyndon Johnson's Air Force Secretary and a leading proponent of saturation bombing in Vietnam. Secretary of the Treasury Michael Blumenthal was the Standard Rich Corporation president. Attorney General Griffin Bell was a segregationist judge who disclosed that he would request inactive status as a member of Atlanta clubs closed to blacks and Jews. Carter himself stated that housing should be segregated. Energy Coordinator James Schlesinger was a proponent of the winnable nuclear war. Transportation Secretary Brock Adams was a staunch proponent of Lockheed's supersonic transport. National Security Advisor Brzezinski was an anti-Soviet fanatic who said in an interview with The New Yorker that it was egocentric to worry that a nuclear war between the U.S. and the USSR would entail the end of the human race. Sentiments that you hear still to this day. Since it was unlikely that every last human being would perish in such an event, Brzezinski recommended that critics of the U.S. nuclear policy abstain from narcissistic concern for the mere hundreds of millions of people who would. In what William Greider, author of The Secrets of the Temple, a study of the Federal Reserve Bank, called his most important appointment, Carter named Paul Volcker, and this is a very important appointment, to the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank. Stuart Eisenstadt, Carter's assistant for the domestic affairs, said that Volcker was selected because he was the candidate of Wall Street. The Wall Street agenda became clear when Volcker contracted the money supply and declared, "The standard of living of the average American has to decline." This is a very famous line. Wealth was funneled upward and wages and production declined. Unemployment and bankruptcy rose. Unions shriveled and disappeared. Pentagon spending soared. For the first time ever, American white-collar families couldn't save money. With urban housing costs zooming, workers fled to remote suburbs, but the increased commute expenses tended to cancel out the cheaper mortgages. Moonlighting and overtime work increased, but added income disappeared in and out. Second commutes and higher childcare increased. As the cost of necessities outpaced wage gains, only credit cards could fill the widening gap. Hamburger stands and nursing homes proliferated while well-paid manufacturing jobs fled to the third world. The workforce of the future was said to be a generation of super efficient robots. And I think on that note, we can get to the GDF video, The Day Democrats Destroyed the Economy.
On December 7, 1981, 45-year-old James von Brunn entered the headquarters of the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. After writing his name on the sign-in sheet, von Brunn explained to a security guard that he was a photographer intending to take pictures of the boardroom inside. After being told he'd have to wait, von Brunn sprinted up the staircase, and the security guard swiftly chased after him. Von Brunn was then met by another guard in a corridor and promptly pulled out a sawed-off shotgun. Before he could pull the trigger, von Brunn was overpowered. In a bag slung over his shoulder, security recovered a .38 caliber revolver and a hunting knife. He then claimed to have planted a bomb in the building, which turned out to be a hoax, leading to the building being evacuated. He said he was distraught over high interest rates and the state of the economy. Driving throughout the U.S., through its countryside and urban areas, through cities and towns big and small, the corpses of industry litter the landscape. Abandoned factories, plants, and yards are reduced to overgrown and decaying structures. Whole towns and cities have been gutted by the void, causing a mass exodus of working-class communities. The factories that sustained the lives of millions of families were not killed off by the gradual and natural process of neoliberalism or Reaganomics, but by a deliberate policy exacted on the economy all at once. Indeed, Ronald Reagan has been a convenient scapegoat for liberals to unload all of the ills of the economy onto. And while his fiscal policies have set the stage for deregulation and cuts to social spending, causing a massive wealth redistribution to the upper crust, it is the monetary policy from just before his presidency which set the stage for the 1980s. The American post-war boom brought unprecedented prosperity. Millions of families became homeowners. The government subsidized cutting-edge industries that added to their global hegemony. But, of course, the side effect of a booming economy is inflation. The Federal Reserve is in the position of the chaperone who has ordered the punch bowl removed just when the party was really warming up. Inflation had become out of control in the 1970s, and by 1980, the Consumer Price Index showed an annual inflation increase of 13.5%, the highest it's ever been. President Jimmy Carter was sandbagged for the state of the economy, and therefore inflation was the Democratic Party's cross to bear. Carter made the decision to shake up monetary policy in a dramatic way, and would appoint a towering figure, both metaphorically and literally, as he stood at 6'7", one of the most influential Federal Reserve chairs in its history, Paul Adolph Volcker Jr. Paul Volcker would be chosen to be the executioner of the economy, and the Federal Reserve marched in lockstep with big banks to achieve their aims. Now, this video isn't just about how private banks influence Federal Reserve policy. You'll have to watch my last Fed video for that, which is on the screen now. But just as a quick review, the Federal Reserve System consists of a board of governors in Washington and 12 reserve banks throughout the country. Back in 1979, the heads of the reserve banks were mostly chosen by the private banks in their districts. But what I didn't go over in my last video is the Federal Advisory Council, or FAC. Put simply, the FAC are private bankers chosen by the reserve banks who meet with the Board of Governors 4 times a year. In 1979, the FAC members included the chairman of the board of Citibank, for example. On September 7, 1979, the FAC would have one of their routine meetings. It would prove to be one of the most consequential in modern American history. According to the minutes of the meeting, the bankers urged the governors to target the amount of money in the economy rather than concerning themselves with interest rates. To achieve this, interest rates would reach their highest levels in history. This monetary theory is otherwise known as monetarism and was popularized by Milton Friedman, probably the most influential economist of the 20th century, rivaled only by John Maynard Keynes.
Another demon.
To show how impactful this meeting was, the Board of Governors would come to the same conclusion themselves 3 weeks later. The governors would not tell the president of their decision for a month. This is legal because the Federal Reserve is not obligated to inform the president about their decisions. Indeed, neither the president nor Congress were consulted about this momentous event, and their experiment would be implemented in earnest on October 6, 1979. There wasn't any question that the board knew that recession would follow. That's the penalty you have to pay for going out too far on the inflation side. Before March 31st, 1980, there existed laws against excessive interest rates, called anti-usury laws. There was even a cap on interest rates, called an interest rate ceiling. In the post-New Deal world, when interest rates hit their ceiling, depositors withdrew their money, which forced banks to stop lending. This naturally cooled down the economy. But on March 31st, 1980, President Jimmy Carter would sign the Monetary Control Act, passed through both the Democrat-controlled Senate and Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. In an instant, lending institutions and banks could now charge any interest rate on loans that they wanted. The social implications were obvious. Borrowers, businesses, and consumers would pay higher interest rates, and creditors would enjoy higher returns on their wealth. The unregulated interest rates, coupled with the Fed's new tightening of money, would change the American landscape forever. The consequences would be far-reaching and varied. Just to put it in perspective, the federal funds rate, the most important interest rate metric, which refers to short-term interest rates between banks, is making the news now as of February 2023 for reaching its highest level in 15 years, of over 4%. By January of 1980, it would reach almost 14%. By April, it was nearly 18%. And after relenting for a brief period, the Fed would increase the Fed funds rate rapidly, up to 20% by January of 1981. What followed was the worst recession since the Great Depression. For nearly 2 years, the unemployment rate increased every single month. And by 1982, 12 million people were out of work, with millions more relegated to part-time, a total of as many as 20 million people. But the so-called dragon of inflation was slayed, and the inflation rate was curtailed to under 4%. What was the result of this? Well, the recession, as all recessions, was very profitable for banks and holders of large financial wealth, as explained in my last video about the Fed. Bankers enjoyed the high returns from loans made just before the recession and used the cheaper money from during the recession to invest and make even more money. Their cash and dollar-denominated assets started to appreciate
It also contributed to the financialization of every sector
due to low inflation, and they became extraordinarily wealthy. While construction, manufacturing, and farming took...
Can you explain to your financially illiterate chat that raising rates is necessary to stop hyperinflation? Your uneducated chat doesn't understand Volcker saved the USA from hyperinflation. Educate them, please. So there's a couple components that factor into the hyperinflation that took place. Obviously, oil was a major contributor to that. But I don't know why, especially when we're talking about the 70s and 80s, Americans tend to operate on today's understanding of the economy, that there is simply no fiscal policy that could ever be implemented at that time frame. And the only way to combat inflation, is with monetary policy. There are fiscal policies that you could implement. The problem is implementing fiscal policy is much harder because now you have partisan values at play. You have partisanship at play. You have disruptors. You have people who are going to play the role of obstructionists. Now, fiscal policy, of course, is fiscal policy happens through legislation. Monetary policy, on the other hand, happens through the Fed. Okay? the Fed limiting or increasing the money supply. If you don't have any interest in applying fiscal policy, if you don't have any interest in applying fiscal policy, any sort of like deflationary mechanism through fiscal policy, yes, you are going to do this. You are going to solve the problem in a way that ends up benefiting the banks. This is the story of exactly that.
Historic and permanent losses, 1981 produced more returns for banks than at any time in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. And what did the banks do with all this wealth? Surely they invested it responsibly and carefully. Actually, they started loaning it to underdeveloped countries. To paint a picture of just how reckless and brazen American bankers had become, 9 of the largest U.S. banks' risk exposure, meaning the amount loaned compared to their capital, was over 200%. This meant that if a country defaulted on a loan, the loss would wipe out more than 2 times the money that the bank had on hand. For the poor countries, what economists call least developed countries, or LDCs, things became very bad during the recession. For starters, the Federal Reserve raising interest rates raised them around the globe, so countries had to pay more for their debt. But on top of that, they lost their most important export market, the United States. The lack of demand created what is now known as the LDC debt crisis. The Fed mobilized to facilitate currency swaps, swapping currencies with countries, giving them much-needed dollars to back up their economies. This bided them enough time before the IMF would enter the equation. Starting with Mexico, the IMF would loan money to roughly 15 countries, culminating in the beginning of the era of the Structural Adjustment Program, or SAPs. SAPs were how the IMF would apply conditions to loans that included cruel austerity measures, including privatizing industries causing mass layoffs, suspension of price controls, wage cuts, and cuts to welfare programs in already miserably poor countries. These countries' budgets would be oriented toward paying back loans, which became impossible given the high interest rates, which compounded, creating a larger balance sheet for them to pay every year. This virtual Ponzi game would increase the debt burden for years to come. According to the World Bank, another partner in the destruction of developing economies, in 1982, the Caribbean and South America owed $330 billion in debt. By 1984, they owed $374 billion. As is widely known today, developing economies have never recovered from the sweeping neoliberal reforms from the era of the Structural Adjustment Program. Over in America, unemployment reached 11%. Most of them were concentrated in the industrial sector, construction, mining, manufacturing. In fact, 23% of the automobile industry was...
IMF loans are the literal reason India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka are in the economic situation they're in right now. When the USSR collapsed, the prime minister that just passed away this week had to take IMF loans when he was the finance minister because India was a manufacturing hub for the USSR. This started the neoliberalization of India, which would give us Modi later on.
Unemployed, as well as 29% of miners and 22% of construction workers. Typically in periods of economic downturn and mass layoffs, the economy would pick back up and industrial workers were able to enter the job market once again. But in the 1980s, the manufacturing and industrial sector withered away and died for good. There's a reason for that. To many Americans, the idea of devaluing the dollar sounds like a bad thing, even vaguely unpatriotic perhaps. A weak dollar must weaken our mighty nation. A strong dollar means a strong economy. You would probably be surprised to learn that the strong dollar is, more than anything else, the primary cause of the decimation of American manufacturing. This isn't a secret to economists and the board members of the Federal Reserve. The correlation between a strong dollar and weakening economy is well known.
What happens if you don't pay back the IMF? That's not a thing. You're done. Then no country will lend you money. And at worst, a leadership that refuses to do that, well, they'll find themselves no longer in power.
After the 2008 crash, the Fed governors and presidents discussed at their meetings how they were going to stimulate the economy. I won't go into quantitative easing in this video, that will be the subject of a future project, but in discussing their plan, the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank president spoke earnestly about their goals. Another desired benefit is to devalue the dollar to stimulate demand for our exports, and I don't think we should be saying that publicly. Put simply, when the dollar is worth less compared to other currencies, American goods become cheaper. So those exporting agricultural products, for example, are able to find buyers who will take advantage of cheap American goods. This means more economic output, more jobs. The opposite happens when the dollar...
Also in Sri Lanka, when the neolibs took power in the 70s again, they turned towards the IMF and US aid, and the US and Israel started to sell Sri Lanka weapons to commit genocide against the Tamils. Yeah. They'll always find a guy who will. Somehow, mysteriously, there will always be a person who will work tirelessly to implement austerity measures and take out additional loans in order to pay the fucking to pay the principal on the previous loans, and also will be a willing servant of the West. At least historically, that's what has happened always and forever.
Dollar is too high. Foreign imports, like Japanese cars for example, have a competitive edge, and American producers and workers suffer as a result. Not only Americans, developing countries holding debt, which is paid back in dollars, have a
Do you ban chatters to support North Korea critically? Am I allowed to have that take here? I don't know what you're, like, what do you mean?
Heavier burden as well. In this way, the consequences span far and wide. Even the president of the New York Federal Reserve candidly admitted as much. We are decimating our export industries. Volker and I are extremely concerned about the long-term effects of the strong dollar. The rising dollar was caused by the high interest rates, which were higher than interest rates in other countries. Martin Feldstein, the Harvard economist and chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, would agree. The fall in exports and the rise in imports that result from the stronger dollar are clearly causing unemployment and threatening individual firms with possible bankruptcy. The establishment economists knew better than anyone else what was going on. Even the architect of the operation, Fed Chairman Paul Volcker, relented that the dollar was a big mistake. I kept worrying about the dollar coming down with a thud, but by late summer of 1984, it became apparent that this was taking starch out of manufacturing. And that's putting it lightly. Jobs were extinguished, many of them high-wage unionized jobs. The destruction of the dollar was permanent. The high interest rate...
Okay, but the profits went up quite a bit. Okay, and it would make way for profits to rise spectacularly, especially in the Reagan era. So, profits for corporations. It virtually gutted American manufacturing, American industry, American labor. It destroyed, it was the final blow, or it was like starting basically the final death blow to American labor power in general. But top donor lights streamer car on fire. Dude, why do you think I would fucking watch that right now? Just take a day off.
Rates, the dollar, the unemployment, the outsourcing, all created a perfect storm, a sinister marriage of high interest rates and depressed wages. For the first time since World War II, the percentage of American families that owned their homes decreased. To quote William Greider, the old would lend their money to the young at higher prices than ever before. Young families forming in the 1980s, setting out to buy a car or their first home, would confront credit terms and interest rates that would have terrified their parents. Double-digit mortgages and floating rates that left them vulnerable to default. Homeownership, the central component of what was described as the American dream, would gradually shrink among the population, most dramatically among younger families. In one fell swoop, the decision to pass the Monetary Control Act in 1980 proved to be a fatal blow to the idea of a stable income, being able to live securely.
I don't understand anything. Could you please summarize? I don't understand anything. How do you profit? How do profit go up if you're not selling anything because your manufacturing is done? Wait, what? No, American companies are still selling shit. It's just not being manufactured in the United States. It's being offshored into countries that we've destroyed. Sometimes through the IMF and the World Bank, other times through direct war, other times we're just taking advantage of the destabilization that's taking place. But ultimately, even with the increasingly complicated web of international trade, manufacturing costs go down dramatically when you don't have to actually use domestic labor and you can just use manufacturing hubs overseas. Profits go up, but profits going up doesn't mean anything for you. It doesn't mean anything for you at all. Maybe sometimes outside of the cost of goods being relatively low. But the price for that is actually fairly damaging to longer economic trends. That's why you have so many ghost cities in the heartland of America. That's why, even though the GDP goes up, or even though the stock market is doing fantastic, the average American doesn't see the benefits of said reality, and that's why homelessness goes up. That's why people just no longer have the same stable income and a livable wage that has to be fought for every step of the way. A lot of the Americans believe that when the economy is doing well, or if the stock market is doing well, then they're doing well as well. And there have been many initiatives to universalize that as well, to make people feel like it's, they have a vested interest in the continued profits of corporations. Corporate profits go up, stock market does better. You have a 401k. You believe that your net worth is going up as a consequence of that. Your nest egg is doing better as a consequence of that. Okay. Meanwhile, as is the case with every other aspect of capitalism, the gains are not socialized. The gains are in the hands of the few. The losses, on the other hand, well, the losses are socialized. So when the stock market is doing poorly, you actually feel it. When the stock market is doing well, you don't actually feel it. It's that dumb argument, Alabama has a higher GDP per capita than Spain, as if that meant the quality of life was in any way comparable. Exactly. It's true. The poorest American state in the nation has a higher GDP per capita than fucking most, the entire nation of England. Okay. Not feeling it is feeling it? What do you mean? What contributes to profits in many circumstances, does not actually benefit you. Okay? I'll give you one very easy example. When a massive corporation merges with another or acquires another company and they lay off a shit ton of the employees, let's say they lay off 100,000 employees, okay? Not 100,000, 10,000 employees. They've done this at the behest of eliminating redundancy, okay? Their stock prices go up. They're doing very well in the stock market. But for 10,000 people, they just fucking lost their jobs. So does that translate? Does that translate to a healthier economy overall? What the markers of success for a healthy economy, a robust economy, are sometimes diametrically opposed to the interests of the population. This concept, unfortunately, is sheltered, especially with the increasingly financialized industries that we have in the United States of America. Immediate harm to the consumer, immediate harm to the the most tangible harm that you can foresee is something like all the controversies surrounding Boeing. Boeing at this point is no longer one of the most significant titans of American industry. Although there's still plenty of, especially because of defense, plenty of things that Boeing manufactures within the United States with American hands. Having said that, they've increasingly outsourced their manufacturing, certain parts of their manufacturing, and constantly cut corners. This has created genuinely less safe products overall. This is yet another aspect of Boeing basically behaving like a bank. When I say financialization of American manufacturing, or financialization of every sector of every sector of the American economy, what I mean is virtually every company that under normal circumstances is supposed to like create a product, sell that product to you, and then their profits go up as a consequence of that, as long as they can make sure that the product that they're selling to you is competitive in a normal market, and is good and is relatively affordable. Nowadays, that does not factor into a company's success or its profit margins as much as the financial components, the constant investment and constant redistribution of its own assets. Every company turns into a bank, okay? And the financial moves that they make basically play a more important role in their profits increasing than the actual product that they're putting out there. What is this? Very good short explainer.
Great again.
The most patriotic thing you could do for your country is your homework. Dying is easy. Math is hard. What the fuck?
They have a point. America's...
What? Why are you sending this to me?
In America, owning your own home and having wages reliably protected by strong unions. Democrats did this. To the enthusiasm of Republicans, no doubt, and the encouragement of Republican thinkers, namely Milton Friedman and Republican President Ronald Reagan. The economic legacy of the Democratic Party is merely a synthesis with the right to adopt conservative money policies. Democrats used their power to implement policies which were the brainchild of Milton Friedman. Democrats did the bidding of the right. This should be taught and remembered.
The big pivot from classical capitalism, manufacturing, to finance capitalism, we already saw the hurt from that in 2008, 2009, but it just kept going. Yes. So initiatives implemented under the Carter administration that were supercharged in the Reagan administration are directly responsible for the financialization. And every other administration that came afterwards continued that legacy. Also, I missed 50 gifted there, so I gotta... I have to say, shouts out to Spec Drum for the 50 community gifted subs, allowing 50 people to be able to send me links and whatnot, which you can also, if you didn't get gifted there, you can also participate and become a subscriber by subscribing for, I think it's $4.50 for new subscribers right now, or for free with a Twitch Prime. Boeing managers will pressure you nonstop to push out product, and then you have to threaten them with law, so you can't just do the quality as required for the product. They don't care for quality, only quantity. Okay. I see the NVIDIA and rival setting for FPS with good visuals just now, by the way. What? As a link? I don't understand. But yeah, we talked about that. We talked about that because Carter also bears responsibility for this. Okay? How do you maintain faith for the Democratic Party to pull through when all they do is bow to the Republicans? I know certain party members do epic work, but I have a hard time trying to talk to my jaded friends about why there's still hope logically when logically there seems to be none. Yeah, I think that electoralism and entryism serves a different purpose than what a lot of hardline leftists believe. And that purpose is to continue getting broad coverage and a platform to be able to present your ideas. That's the most significant factor here. Okay? But going back to Carter, Carter's populist assurances simply whetted the public appetite for this kind of dismal anticlimax while making a few listless gestures towards blacks and the poor. He spent the bulk of his energy promoting corporate profits and building up a huge military machine that drained away public wealth in defense of a far-flung network of repressive friends of American business. The heaviest applause line in his inaugural address was his promise to move this year a step towards our ultimate goal, the elimination of all nuclear weapons from this earth. But after his beguiling rhetoric faded away, he embarked on a program of building 2 to 3 nuclear bombs every day. Although he had promised to cut military spending by $5 to $7 billion, he decided to increase it just after 6 months in office, and his 5% proposed spending increases in each of his last 2 years in office were identical to those first proposed by Ronald Reagan. He decided to increase it just after 6 months in office. Furthermore, having pledged to reduce foreign arms sales, he ended up raising them to new highs. And after speaking of helping the needy, he proposed cutbacks in summer youth jobs, child nutrition programs, and other popular projects serving important social needs. Similarly, though he had campaigned as a friend of labor, he refused to request to increase the minimum wage and oppose most organized labor's legislative agenda while handing out huge subsidies to big business. He made much ado about human rights, but returned Haiti's fleeing boat people to the tender care of baby Doc Duvalier. And when a member of the American delegation of the UN Human Rights Commission spoke of his profoundest regrets for the CIA's role in General Pinochet's bloodbath in Chile, Carter scolded him, insisting that the CIA's actions were not illegal nor improper. Carter came to Washington proclaiming his desire for comprehensive Middle East peace, including a solution to the Palestinian question in all of its aspects, something that we covered extensively. Yet at Camp David, he failed to grasp the root of the problem, let alone propose a mature way of dealing with it. He assumed that Palestinians were anonymous refugees whose nationalist aspirations could be safely ignored. He supposed a peace treaty could be signed in the absence of the PLO. World recognizes the Palestinian sole legitimate representative. He offered no apologies for negotiating an agreement that failed to even mention Jewish settlements in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. And he apologized for voting against Jewish settlements in the West Bank when the American nation did something unthinkable instead of abstaining. He did not protest Prime Minister Menachem Begins' presentation at the Accords before the Israeli Knesset as a deal, one much more favorable to Israel than to the Arabs. He pretended not to notice that corralling Palestinians in the Bantustans was not simply a tactic of war, but constituted Israel's boasted final product of peace. It's so weird because for a lot of history started on October 7 enjoyers, okay, when the first blow out of nowhere came from the heart of the Palestinian enclave, these barbaric anti-Semitic monsters who simply wanted to do death and destruction. It kind of feels like maybe history didn't start on October 7. What do I mean by this? The sidestepping of the PLO or the Palestinian delegation when having conversations with Israel and other Arab nations once again plays a formative role in the way America chose to deal with this over and over again. Interestingly enough, this was a major factor in October 7, as I've repeated time and time again. Donald Trump and his administration's Israel policy unshackling and unrestricting the last remnants of any kind of normalcy with the way that Israel operates in its 76-year, almost 77-year apartheid regime, permanently annexing and recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli territory in direct contravention with international law, or moving the embassy, the American embassy, to Jerusalem, solidifying Israel's occupation in Jerusalem, which is a big fuck you to all of the Abrahamic religion enjoyers, and certainly the Palestinians. But last but not least, completely writing out the Palestinians and their understandable humanitarian needs and their need for emancipation from the equation by implementing the Abraham Accords with all of the American client states in the Gulf, all the way to the furthest reaches of the North African continent. Palestinians were left with no hope. They were pushed into a corner, and they recognized that they were in a corner with no other options, and the only way to get out of that corner was to fight their way out. Just so you understand. But the reason why I brought up Donald Trump is because, once again, Peaceful Dove Carter, who many yelled at, who many even still champion to this day, the Camp David Accords, as a pivotal moment in American peaceful intervention in the region, very clearly implemented the similar doctrine of sidestepping Palestinians in the Israel conversation. Years before Donald Trump did this, and years before October 7. Finally, his much praised Camp David Accords were the death warrant for Lebanon, as Israel, his southern border secured with the removal of Egypt from the Arab military alliance, was free to concentrate undivided attention on a long-planned invasion across his northern border. It was this invasion, June 1982, that convinced Osama bin Laden that only mass murder of Americans could ever change U.S. foreign policy. Osama bin Laden, of course, was very wrong. Carter was also an American ally. Carter was accused originally as an anti-Soviet warrior on the paving the path to peace, as written famously about in Western media. Carter was effusive in his praise and blind support of the Shah of Iran, who was deeply unpopular in his country due to policies of supermilitarization, forced modernization, and systematic torture. By the time Carter arrived in the White House, the Shah's throne sat atop a veritable powder keg. Iranian cities were hideously unlivable, with 15% of the country crowded around Tehran in shanty dwellings lacking sewage or other water facilities. The nation's incalculable oil wealth reached few hands, and a restless student generation had no prospects. The country's bloated bureaucracy was totally corrupt. While Shiite leaders rallied popular support, the Shah's secret police threw tens of thousands of Iranians in the jail. The economy gagged on billions of dollars of Western arm imports, mostly from Washington, and Amnesty International speculated that Iran had achieved the worst human rights records on the planet. Meanwhile, Carter declared that human rights is the soul of our foreign policy, though he added the following day that he thought the Shah might not survive in power. A strange expectation if, indeed, the U.S. stood for human rights around the world. After the Shah was overthrown, Carter could not conceive of U.S. responsibility for the actions of enraged Iranian students who seized 66 Americans and held them hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, demanding the return of the criminal Shah. He had admitted that the Shah to the U.S. for emergency medical treatment for cancer, thus precipitating the hostage crisis. To Carter, Americans were, by definition, innocent outside of history, and he dismissed the Iranian grievances against the U.S. as ancient history, refusing to discuss them. In his distorted mind, Iranians were terrorists by nature, and Iran had always been a potentially terrorist nation, regardless of what they had suffered at the U.S. hands. In short, without the Shah, Carter regarded Iran as a land of swarthy and crazed medievalists, what Washington today calls a rogue state. Having lost, in air quotes, Iran, a key U.S. ally in the Middle East, along with military outposts and electronic eavesdropping stations used against the Soviet Union, the Carter administration began supporting the Afghan Islamic fundamentalists, not making an issue of their having kidnapped the American ambassador in Kabul that year, 1979, which resulted in his death in a rescue attempt. While U.S. officials condemned Islamic militants in Iran as terrorists, they praised them as freedom fighters in Afghanistan. Maybe the U.S. were the sectarians all along. The Sunni supremacist attitude. Different when the Shia does it. They don't believe in the 12 imams or whatever. Anyway, though both groups drew inspiration from the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was, in the eyes of official Washington, the devil incarnate. I guess the Afghan ones might have been, some of them were Shia militants too. I don't know. I'm not familiar with which rung of the Taliban we're talking about. Or not Taliban, the Mujahideen. In a 1998 interview, Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, admitted that the U.S. had begun giving military assistance to the Islamic fundamentalist Mujahideen in Afghanistan 6 months before the USSR invaded the country, even though he was convinced, as he told Carter, that this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. Among the consequences of that policy were a decade and a half of war that claimed the lives of 1 million Afghans. Mujahideen torture that U.S. government officials called indescribable horror. Half of the Afghan population either dead, crippled, or homeless in the creation of thousands of Islamic fundamentalist warriors dedicated to unleashing spectacularly violent attacks in countries throughout the world. The list of disastrous policies can go on. For example, Carter continued the Ford administration's policy of backing Indonesia's occupation of East Timor, which killed tens of thousands of Timorese during Carter's years in office and roughly a third of the Timorese population overall between 1975 and 1979. In 1977 to 78, while Indonesia engaged in wholesale destruction in the form of massive bombardment, wiping out villages and crops, and relocations of populations to concentration camps, the Carter administration extended the military and diplomatic support necessary to make it all possible. In late 1977, Washington replenished Indonesia's depleted supplies with a sharp increase in the flow of military equipment. Jakarta used U.S.-supplied OV-10 Broncos, planes designed for counterinsurgency operations, encouraging the ferocious attacks that reduced East Timor to the level of Pol Pot's Cambodia. In a 1979 interview with the New York Times, Father Leoneto Vieira de Rego, a Portuguese priest who spent years in the mountains of East Timor between 1976 and 79, said that the genocide and starvation was the result of full-scale incendiary bombing. What is happening? Why are people saying XUCL? I personally witnessed, while running to protected areas, going from tribe to tribe, the great massacre from bombardment and people dying from starvation. In May 1980, Brian Eads reported from the London Observer that malnutrition and disease are still more widespread than in ravaged Cambodia. Relating to the comments of an official recently back from a visit to Cambodia, Eads added that by the criteria of distended bellies, intestinal disease, and brachial parameter, the measurement of the upper arm, the East Timorese are in a worse state than the Khmers, another stellar achievement of the Human Rights Administration. Furthermore, during Carter's brief reign, he ordered the production of the neutron bomb, which his administration praised for only destroying people while leaving property intact, endorsed flexible response and limited nuclear war, lobbied for the radar-evading cruise missile, developed a rapid deployment force for instant intervention anywhere, enacted selective service registration in peacetime, and advocated the construction of the first strike MX missiles for the use in a nuclear shell game along an elaborate system of underground railroad tracks proposed for the Utah desert. While lecturing the Soviets on human rights, he escalated state terror in El Salvador, crushed democracy in South Korea, which we talked about briefly. I think there's a thread here for it as well, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, maybe not. Oh, here it is. Or no, this is the Brazilian one. There was another thread on the Gwangju uprisings, which was also long-standing American policy, allowing the military dictatorship to continue with American support to dominate any kind of general strike or any kind of anti-government intervention. Any kind of populist uprising was violently squashed. The people of Gwangju rose up against Chun Do-hwan's military dictatorship, calling for democracy in South Korea. In response, with a green light from the U.S., South Korean police and soldiers massacred 2,300 people. We will never forget the martyrs of Gwangju. On October 1979, former President Park Chung-hee was assassinated by his own head of security, Chang Do-hwan, then seized power via military coup. Oh, this was the one I was looking for. Jimmy Carter approved an operation to crush the pro-democracy uprising in Gwangju, South Korea, against the U.S.-backed military dictatorship. South Korean military forces killed at least 600 people and injured over 4,000. U.S.-backed dictator Chun Do-hwan. By the way, those numbers are always incredibly inconsistent, and impossible to fully figure out. Like, I'll give you an example of an earlier. I'll give you an example of an earlier version of this, an earlier thing that happened in Jeju. The governor of Jeju at the time said that the number that was slain by the South Korean government, which was, again, directly killed because of the guerrilla militant uprising against the South Korean, against the South Korean dictatorship. The governor at the time said that it was 60,000. We don't know what the official numbers are. The reason why we don't know what the official numbers are is because the remnants of the Japanese colonial occupation-backed police forces alongside the military made no mention or didn't keep consistent records. Still don't know. And there are initiatives in South Korea right now that try to make sense of the atrocities and try to create like a truth and honesty commission or whatever, like to try to figure out exactly what happened. And yes, they weren't even explicitly communist, although there were some who were pro-DPRK by the end of the process. They were more tribal and communal, so the South Korean forces thought they'd support the North. They did resist the South Koreans from dominating their island. They also did, by the end of the process, openly say, like, understandably, that they would want to unify the entire Korean peninsula. The crackdown, this is a different one, though. That was a decade prior. This, on the other hand, is in, or I guess 2 decades prior. This, on the other hand, or 3 decades prior. Sorry, math is not my strong suit. The crackdown was carried out by South Korean special forces trained for missions inside of North Korea. They beat people with clubs, stabbed and mutilated them with bayonets, threw at least 20 from high buildings, and used U.S.-supplied weapons, which killed protesters. One witness described the soldiers' brutality. A cluster of troops attacked each student individually. Hey, door's open. No. One witness described the soldiers' brutality. A cluster of troops attacked each student individually. They would crack his head, stomp his head, kick him in the face. When soldiers were done, he looked like a pile of clothes in a meat sauce. The brutality caused the Gwangju protests to swell and also take up arms and liberate the city in the style of the Paris Commune. Daily citizens' assemblies were created, and much of the entire city joined the protests, creating a self-governing community. I mean, the brutality was so ridiculous that, like, there were even points throughout Korean history where, like, even the military refused to engage in the actions. So this is important to also recognize when we talk about, like, the South Korean tendency for facilitating general strikes and rising up against its government, and how even all the way down to its recent history, Koreans have a long tradition of fighting against its brutal regime. Korean right-wingers still argue that the term Gwangju protest is riot because foreign media use the term Gwangju uprising. Wait till they find out there's a Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Yeah. Now, Jimmy Carter's administration oversaw that, just so you understand. A good video about the Che balls that came out from Fern. Ooh, that's sick. I love reading about this. I love learning about the Che balls. Gave full support to Indonesia's near genocide. We talked about that. Maintain or increase funding for the Shah, Somoza Marcos, Brazil's neo-Nazi generals, and the dictatorships of Guatemala, Nicaragua, Indonesia, Bolivia, and Zaire. He refused to heed Archbishop Romero's desperate plea to cut off U.S. aid to the blood-drenched Salvadoran junta, and Romero was promptly assassinated. Furthermore, he said nothing at all when the London Sunday Times revealed that the torture of Arabs implicated all of Israel's security forces and was so systematic that it cannot be dismissed as a handful of rogue cops exceeding orders. And though he presented himself as sympathetic to those who had opposed the Vietnam War, he refused to pay reconstruction aid on the grounds that during the devastating U.S. attack on the tiny country, the destruction was mutual. Oh, continuing Nixon's legacy. Okay. Carter turned to... This is why when parties shift, this is why I talk about how foreign policy, American foreign policy is uniparty. Okay? There are some minor differences, oftentimes led by Republican administrations making things worse overall. But the Democrats are certainly willing participants in the continuation of that rightward shift.
For the longest time,
this is how we arrive at the post 9/11 universe of like both parties being overtly pro-war, pro-militarism, pro-international intervention with direct boots on the ground military warfare. Carter turned domestic policy over to Wall Street, which we talked about a little bit, refusing to increase the minimum wage and telling his cabinet that increasing social spending is something we just can't do. According to Peter Bourne, a special assistant to the president in the Carter White House, he did not see healthcare as every citizen's right, though every other industrial state in the world except apartheid South Africa disagreed with him. He understood that liberals desired it, but Bourne notes he never really accepted it. Instead, he preferred to talk movingly of his deep and genuine empathy for those who suffered for lack of healthcare, as though the depth of his compassion could be a substitute for a major new and expensive government solution for the problem.
The donut.
In point of fact, money can be saved under a government-funded plan, but Carter was uninterested. He insisted on controlling business costs rather than providing universal coverage, neglecting to note that under Medicare, universal insurance for the elderly, administrative costs were a fraction of those charged under private HMOs. Carter simply could not comprehend that the vast unmet social needs that existed and exist in the United States. He thought there was no way to maintain a global military presence, balance the budget, and keep business costs low while adequately meeting social welfare needs via reorganizing programs. When his Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Joe Califano, informed him that without increased funding, many welfare recipients will be worse off and after any reorganization than before, Carter erupted. "Are you telling me that there is no way to improve the present welfare system except by spending billions of dollars? In that case, to hell with it." In response to a comment that his denial of federal funding for poor people's abortions was unfair, Carter summed up the political philosophy that rendered him hopelessly unprogressive. Well, as you know, there are many things in life that are not fair, that wealthy people can afford and poor people cannot, like political candidates who do their bidding. So understand, like I said, that he was a standard shitty American president that oversaw many atrocities both globally and also kick-started the process of, or continued the process of neoliberalization of the American economy, which of course led its way to Ronald Reagan completely destroying any chance of any hopeful prospect.
I just
of
won't say anything.
A good. They were actually Hamas. It was 2000. Any hopeful prospect of like fixing the American workforce's material needs, solving their material needs. So yeah, not the best guy overall.
When he decided on glasnost and perestroika, and that in effect resulted in the dismantlement of the Soviet Union and also resulted in the withdrawal of Soviet invading troops from Afghanistan.
Despite his ongoing struggles with the Soviets, Carter forged major accomplishments in foreign policy, opening diplomatic relations with China, pushing through a Panama Canal Treaty, and brokering a historic Middle East peace deal.
Sun and tension on the Egyptian-Israeli border.
I recognized before I was president the importance of the Mideast crisis between Israel and Egypt, because there had been 4 major wars in the previous 25 years. I was able to bring Sadat and Begin to Camp David, and we had a very successful 13 days there. And we came out with the Camp David Accords, which led 6 months later to a treaty between Israel and Egypt, not a word of which has ever been violated since.
Let us have 3 of us together. Very good.
But the watershed agreement did not fix the problems dogging Carter's presidency. Runaway inflation,
We must face a time of national austerity.
the energy crisis,
All of us must learn to waste less energy.
and a management style that Americans found pessimistic and uninspiring.
It is a crisis of confidence.
The final blow for Carter's re-election came in November 1979.
Good evening. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students.
More than 50 Americans were taken hostage in Iran and held for 444 days until the final hours of Carter's presidency.
We had adequate warning that there was a threat to our embassy, and we could have done what other embassies did, either strengthen our security there or remove our personnel.
Polls predicted a close race, but in the end, Carter won in just 5 states and Washington, D.C.
And this country is almost solidly in the Reagan colors tonight.
After leaving the White House, Jimmy Carter...
Complete and utter domination. Complete and utter domination.
Reinvented himself and redefined the role of a former president, finding his new purpose and esteem as a freelance statesman.
Hemos llegado como amigos.
Carter says even political rivals asked for his diplomatic help.
Ronald Reagan didn't take an active interest in the Mideast. He disavowed many of the things that I had done. And to my surprise, he called me on the phone and asked if I would help draft a speech that he wanted to deliver on the subject. And I responded eagerly. So he sent his national security advisor, or his speechwriter, I can't remember which, down to my home. And in the front room of my house, we drafted the portion of his speech delivered in 1982 on the Middle East.
With respect to the Arab-Israeli conflict, we've embraced the Camp David framework as the only way to proceed.
When George Bush Sr. came into the White House, they were interested in Latin America. They specifically asked me to get involved in holding an election that replaced the Sandinistas peacefully instead of by war. It ended the war. The Contra problem for Nicaragua will be solved by an honest election.
Carter's diplomatic skills really got put to the test in 1994, when tensions between President Clinton and Kim Il-sung over North Korea's nuclear program put the two countries on a collision course.
Kim Il-sung was giving me constant requests that I come to Pyongyang and help him resolve the impasse. I wrote President Clinton a letter and said, I have decided to go to North Korea. Al Gore, the vice president, was in the White House, and he intercepted my letter. And he said, Mr. President, if you'll change your letter to say, I'm strongly inclined to go to North Korea, instead of I'm going to North Korea, I'll try to get President Clinton to agree, to approve.
Carter finally got the green light from the White House, or so he thought.
They didn't think I had any chance to succeed. Good morning. I succeeded.
Key for Carter was having CNN camera crews broadcasting the historic negotiations.
I'm a nuclear engineer by training. I knew the intricacies of their nuclear power plant. I talked to their nuclear specialist and also directed to Kim Il-sung, and he and I agreed that he would not proceed with his nuclear program. My proposal was that there would be an immediate assurance
that the IAEA inspectors would stay on site. When I got back to Seoul, though, I was told by the White House that they were dissatisfied. Al Gore was on the speakerphone. I said, I want to come to Washington and explain what I've done. And he told me, Mr. President, you're not wanted in Washington. Our suggestion is you go directly back to Plains. Well, I was angry, put it mildly. I thought I had prevented a war. I thought I had worked out a satisfactory agreement for the future.
As soon as Carter touched down in the U.S., the press was filled with stories about how Carter had turned what was meant to be a private visit into a televised summit.
There were horrendous stories about me in the New York Times, that I had exceeded my authority and that I had made false claims about the acquiescence of Kim Il-sung, that I was naive and ignorant and so forth. So I sent Kim Il-sung an urgent letter and asked him to confirm to Clinton, not to me, all the agreements he had reached. I think there were 12 of them. And so that was adopted by the Clinton administration as their policy.
That policy did help to avert war, but critics say Jimmy Carter and President Clinton were wrong to appease a rogue nation like North Korea, which would later develop a nuclear arsenal in violation of the agreement he helped broker. In his later years, Carter traveled the globe with the Carter Center to fight disease and monitor elections in emerging democracies.
So we believe that all of our questions have been answered.
Work that earned the former president a Nobel Peace Prize in 2002, just as he was forging a very public campaign opposing the coming American invasion of Iraq.
That global challenges must be met by an emphasis on peace.
When we sat down with President Carter in 2006, he laid out his vision for America's role in the future and his concerns about missteps in the post-9/11 world.
The announcement and practice of preemptive war, the complete abandonment of all the nuclear arms control agreements ever reached, the claim, in effect, that prisoners could be mistreated or tortured or deprived of habeas corpus. These are some of the things that I think has caused a deterioration in our country's basic stature and integrity. I would like to see our country be the champion of human rights, and every American embassy looked upon as a haven for those who suffer from human rights abuse. I'd like to see our country be the most generous on earth.
These are not just my goals, and they will not be my accomplishments, but the affirmation of our nation's continuing moral strength and our belief in an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
Good evening.
You're the substitute teacher putting on a movie for the class. I don't know why everybody always says this. Like, it's important to understand what the mainstream perspective is on Carter after telling you, like, the atrocities that he contributed to.
I'm Allie Rogan. John Yang is away. We begin with breaking news tonight as we learn that former President Jimmy Carter has died. The 100-year-old, known for his humble beginnings and unlikely road to the White House, served from January 1977 to January 1981. History shaped Carter's one term in office, including an economic recession, the Iran hostage crisis, and the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. Carter was this country's longest-living former president, and he died today at his home in Plains, Georgia, surrounded by family. Special correspondent Judy Woodruff looks back at his towering life.
In December of 1974, there was a major headline on the editorial page of the Atlanta Constitution that said, Jimmy Carter is running for what? And what was about this day?
He was seemingly the longest of long shots when he jumped into the 1976 presidential race. But Jimmy Carter wound up celebrating on election night.
I pray that I can live up to your confidence and never disappoint you.
It was the pinnacle of a wide-ranging life that began in 1924 in Plains, Georgia. James Earl Carter was born to Lillian, a nurse, and Earl, a peanut farmer. After a Depression-era upbringing, he finished the U.S. Naval Academy and married hometown sweetheart Rosalind Smith. In time, the newly minted officer rose to the rank of lieutenant in the nuclear submarine service. But he cut short his Navy career after his father's death in 1953 so he could return to Georgia to try to revive the family's struggling peanut farm.
We've always worked for a living. We know what it means.
What? We cannot fault Jimmy Carter for those who came after him. In fact, putting Reagan's many mistakes on him just water out his war crimes. What? So it's inappropriate of me to mention Trump's Abraham Accords when I'm talking about how October 7 happened. Trump's policy in Israel. Because I think it's very important to mention that. I mean, Ronald Reagan is the worst, is the fucking devil. But yes, a lot of the Carter administration's continuation of the former administration's foreign policy in terms of continuing American global dominance against the USSR during the Cold War led to many deaths. I'm not being hard on Carter at all.
Needs to work.
Within a few years, politics beckoned, and Jimmy Carter began his ascent, winning election as a state senator, and then in 1970, governor.
Congratulations, Governor.
He called for the state to transcend deep divisions over race and inequality.
I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over. No poor, rural, weak, or black person should ever have to bear the additional burden of being deprived of the opportunity of an education, a job, or simple justice.
Georgia law then limited governors to a single term. But Jimmy Carter had his eyes on a much bigger prize. On December 12, 1974, he announced he was running for president.
Jimmy who?
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy who?
Outside his home state, candidate Carter began as a virtual unknown. Jimmy Who became a political punchline, even in Carter campaign films. But it was also an asset. Voters had soured on Washington after the Vietnam War and Watergate. And Mr. Carter embraced his outsider status and began climbing in the polls.
I remember when we couldn't find a microphone.
In April 1976, he mused on his appeal in an interview with the McNeil-Lehrer Report, a precursor to the NewsHour.
There's an intensity of commitment to my campaign and a depth of sacrifice among people who volunteer to go all the way to New Hampshire at their own expense, to give up their vacation time, to go back later to Wisconsin. I had over 1,000 Georgians who went into Florida. Other candidates don't have this.
That connection with voters carried him to the Democratic nomination and on a course to face incumbent Republican Gerald Ford that November.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
Mr. Ford had been appointed vice president during Watergate and became president when Richard Nixon resigned in August of 1974. Years later, former President Carter spoke to Jim Lehrer on what it was like as a challenger, debating a sitting president.
I had been quite successful in the primary season, but it was a very disturbing concept for me to be on the stage with the President of the United States. I saw it as a good opportunity to let the people know that I could indeed deal on an equal basis, hopefully, with an incumbent president.
The two men faced each other 3 times that fall.
He says he's learned how to match unemployment with inflation. That's right. We've got the highest inflation we've had in 25 years right now.
But the third debate, just 2 weeks before the election, saw Mr. Carter on the defensive. He had given a candid, in-depth interview to Playboy magazine, and on his religious beliefs, he was quoted as saying, "I've looked on a lot of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times. This is something that God recognizes I will do, and God forgives me for it."
As you know, that Playboy interview could have cost me the election. It was a devastating blow to our campaign. And I thought the best way to handle it was to say, well, I'm sorry that the interview came out, but I couldn't deny that the answers in Playboy were my own answers.
Mr. Carter's lead steadily dwindled through the fall, but on Election Day, his strength in the South and the East was just enough to carry him to victory in the closest presidential contest in decades. The pride of Plains, now the president-elect, brought the celebration to his hometown the morning after.
I think the sun's rising on a beautiful new day, a beautiful new spirit in this country, a beautiful new commitment to the future. I feel good about it, and I love every one of you.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
He took that theme of a new beginning into Inauguration Day, breaking with tradition by walking most of the way down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House. Once there, the new President Carter soon resolved to try for the seemingly impossible, peace in the Middle East. He reflected on that time at a forum in Washington in 2010.
There had been 4 wars in the previous 25 years against Israel, all led by Egypt, which was the only Arab country with enough heft to really challenge Israel. And I wanted to bring peace between Israel and Egypt. That was my preeminent goal.
To that end, Mr. Carter brought Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to Camp David in the late summer of 1978. For 13 days, he mediated until the breakthrough on September 17th. The Camp David Accords laid the foundation for an Egyptian-Israeli peace.
I'm so proud of both of you. God bless you.
And there were other Carter foreign policy initiatives. He restored full diplomatic relations with China, following through on a process that began under President Nixon. He worked to pare back the U.S. and Soviet nuclear arsenals. And he negotiated and signed the treaty to return the Panama Canal to Panama. But on the domestic front, the president grappled with an economy beset by spiking inflation and interest rates and an energy crisis. Just 2 weeks into his tenure, a cardigan-clad Carter urged Americans to conserve during a televised fireside chat.
All of us must learn to waste less energy.
Why didn't they come out and tell us there was no gas?
But by the summer of '79, the public's patience was wearing thin.
I've been here since 4:30 this morning. It's ridiculous waiting online here.
I'm in the line 2 hours in, I can't get gas. This is baloney. Carter doesn't get my vote next year.
With his popularity plunging, President Carter set out to turn the country's mood.
So I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence.
He never actually used the term, but it came to be known as the malaise speech, and it brought new ridicule. Then, in November of that year, half a world away, the greatest crisis of the Carter presidency began: the capture of 66 Americans in Iran, most of them at the U.S. Embassy, all with the tacit backing of that country's new supreme leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. In April 1980, the president authorized an ill-fated military operation to try to free the hostages, but the mission ran into mechanical troubles, and one helicopter crashed, killing 5 U.S. airmen and 3 U.S. Marines.
Classic.
It was the Iran crisis and the nation's deep economic trouble.
Literally the most common. Bro, history just does not change, okay? Like that right there literally still happens to this day all the time. It's pretty wild.
That haunted the Carter re-election bid. Senator Ted Kennedy mounted a primary challenge that lasted until that summer's Democratic convention. Meanwhile, Republicans coalesced around former California Governor Ronald Reagan.
Good morning. How are you?
And Illinois Congressman John Anderson, and also ran in the GOP primaries, turned independent for the general election.
Give me your help. Give me your votes on the 4th of November.
For weeks, the Carter campaign declined to have the president debate both Reagan and Anderson on the same stage.
The man who should be here tonight to respond to those charges chose not to attend.
But finally, just a week before the election, Mr. Carter did square off with Reagan, but found himself outmatched.
Now we have an opportunity to move toward national health insurance. Governor Reagan, again, typically is against such a proposal.
Governor, there you go again.
Reagan used the debate to disarm depictions of himself as an extremist and thus ease voters' fears. He closed with a simple question that summed up his indictment of the Carter presidency.
Do you feel better? You feel better today than you did, right? Isn't that the one where classic?
Well, if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
No. Reagan would later call it a critical moment in the campaign. But in President Carter's eyes,
the major factor in the election had nothing to do with the debate. It was the fact that we went through Election Day, which was the exact one-year anniversary of the hostages being taken in Iran.
By then, the Iranians had freed 14 of the original 66 American hostages. The other 52 remained captive, and Iran refused to budge.
The parliament decided, under Khomeini's pressure, that they would not release the hostages, and this devastating negative news about hostages swept the country right on Election Day. I've always been convinced that this was a major factor.
Whatever the reason, President Carter was trounced that night, and at 9:50 p.m., more than an hour before polls closed on the West Coast, he conceded.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt.
He spent much of his remaining time in office trying to free the Americans held in Tehran while he still could.
And at 10 o'clock on inauguration morning, all the hostages were in an airplane ready to take off, and Khomeini held them until...
I think one of the funniest parts of this, one of the funniest conversations to be had here is that he would literally be, if Biden remained committed to run and wasn't forced out, Donald Trump literally would have had Reagan margins in his victory over Joseph Robinette Brandon. Like it would have been a complete rerun of Carter v. Reagan. Even in terms of like dealing with a foreign ally that is not playing ball in the midst of a hostage crisis. At that point, it was a foreign enemy or foreign adversary for Carter, but Ronald Reagan did cut out a side agreement to extend the hostage crisis. to help his chances in the election. Donald Trump, and for the record, the Carter administration didn't do anything about it. Just like Donald Trump absolutely was directly in contact with Benjamin Netanyahu by his own admission, and the American government did nothing to force Israel's hands into coming to the fucking ceasefire negotiation table. It's crazy.
5 minutes after I was no longer president, then they took off. But that was one of the happiest moments of my life. Every hostage came home safe and free.
The landslide election defeat returned the Carters to civilian life, but they set about on a new life of service that won new respect. In 1982, the former president and wife Rosalind Carter founded the Carter Center, their platform for advancing democracy, peace, and health policy beyond America's borders. The work took them around the world, to places like Nicaragua to monitor elections, and Bosnia to try to end years of fighting. As he told the NewsHour during the 2000 Democratic Convention, it seemed to be ideal work for a former president.
The best times of my life have been after the White House. You have served a great nation, the greatest nation on earth, and then you have freedom from political obligations. You have an almost unlimited menu of things that you can either choose or say no.
His new agenda did lead to occasional run-ins with his successors in the White House, as in 1994, when the Clinton White House balked at Mr. Carter's talks with North Korean leader Kim Il-sung on freezing his government's nuclear program. And in 2002, when he made waves in Cuba, meeting with President Fidel Castro and calling for an end to the decades-long U.S. embargo.
Target!
He was also a vocal critic of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. But his diplomatic work, including the Camp David Accords, ultimately won him the 2002 Nobel Peace Prize and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He remained in the public eye through his final years, and he minced no words in his attitudes about President Trump.
There's no doubt that the Russians did interfere in the election, and I think the interference, although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered.
In 2015, he was diagnosed with melanoma, a cancer that spread to his liver and his brain, but underwent a new treatment that sent it into remission.
I've had a wonderful life. I've had thousands of friends. But now I feel, that it's in the hands of God, whom I worship, and I'll be prepared for anything that comes.
Through it all, Jimmy Carter remained active, especially in his well-known work for Habitat for Humanity, building homes for the poor, and he continued teaching Sunday school in his hometown of Plains. President Biden visited the Carters there early in his term and said the former president had...
It's my favorite photo. It's so grotesque. This photo lives in my brain permanently. It occupies a permanent space in my mind. It's just such a weird fucking photo. It makes the Bidens look like monstrous. Like the Bidens are ginormous, or they're just like the Carters are so tiny, but with massive heads. There's just something so eerie about it, and I love it.
Shown the nation what it means to be a public servant. Age and illness ultimately forced Mr. Carter into home hospice care. And in late 2023, he suffered his greatest loss when Rosalind Carter died at 96. They had been married for 77 years.
This news is funded by viewers like you. Please support our work.
Welcome back to Hardball. We're back with the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. His new book is called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And President Carter, why did you use the word apartheid in the book's title?
Well, let's look at the entire title, if you don't mind. The first word is Palestine, which involves the land that belongs to the Palestinians, not the Israelis. I didn't refer to Israel because there's no semblance of anything relating to apartheid within the nation of Israel. And I also emphasized the word not.
Cap.
That is peace and not apartheid. That's what I hope to accomplish with this book, is some move toward that goal. But there's no doubt that within the occupied territories, Palestinian land, that there is a horrendous example of apartheid. The occupation of Palestinian land, the confiscation of that land that doesn't belong to Israel, the building of settlements on it, the colonization of that land, and then the connection of those isolated but multiple settlements, more than 200 of them, with each other by highways on which Palestinians can't travel, and quite often where Palestinians cannot even cross. So the persecution of the Palestinians now under the occupied territories, is under the occupation forces, is one of the worst examples of human rights deprivation that I know. And I think
even worse, though, than a place like Rwanda?
Yes, I think, yes. You mean now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah,
I think the impression now of the Israelis, of the Palestinians by the Israelis, is worse than a situation in Africa like the oppression of Rwandans and the Civil War.
I'm not going back into ancient history about Rwanda, but right now, the persecution of the Palestinians is one of the worst examples of human rights abuse I know, because the Palestinians...
When you're talking about right now, you're not talking about, say,
I'm not talking about ancient
2 years
history,
ago.
no.
Well, Rwanda wasn't ancient history, it was just a few years ago.
You can talk about Rwanda if you want to. I want to talk about Palestine. What is being done to the Palestinians now is horrendous in their own territory by the occupying powers, which is Israel. They've taken away all the basic human rights of the Palestinians, as was done in South Africa against the blacks. And I make it very plain in this book that the apartheid is not based on racism, as it was in South Africa, but it's based on the desire of a minority of Israelis to acquire land that belongs to the Palestinians and to retain that land, and then to exclude the Palestinians from their own property and subjugate them so that they can't arouse and demonstrate their disapproval of being robbed of their own property. That's what's happening in the West Bank. And the people in this country, in America, never know about this. They never discuss this. There's no debate about it. There's no criticism of Israel in this country. And in Israel, there is an intense debate about the issues in this book. In this country, no.
I agree. I mean, I wish we had that sort of debate that they're having in Israel. I wish we had that in the United States. But give us a sort of sense, how much of the responsibility for the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, do you think belongs to the Israelis for the...
I'm not kidding when I say this shit, dude. The cruelty has gotten worse, obviously, because Israel is not only an apartheid state, but now doing a genocide. But also, the conversation, like the permission structure for having this conversation has also gotten worse. Like the shit that he's saying here, you rarely ever hear in mainstream news now. Like you can't even you cannot have that conversation. Like the journalist does the classic thing, push back. And be like, what about this? What about that? What about Rwanda? Right? But like, ultimately, he just concedes. He says, I'm not trying to talk about Rwanda. I'm trying to talk about Israel. I feel like no former president would ever come out and say shit like this now. As a matter of fact, former presidents have called the West Bank Judea and Samaria. I'm talking, of course, of Bill Clinton when he went to fucking Dearborn, Michigan. Very, very gross. Anyway. Crazy to think.
With their tactics like seizing land and occupying territory that didn't belong to them. How much of it is the responsibility of the Palestinians for their suicide terror attacks and their bombings within Israel proper?
Well, as a matter of fact, the basic cause of the conflict is a sustained occupation of other people's land by the Israelis. And this is a direct violation of United Nations resolutions. It's a direct violation of the International Quartet's roadmap. It's a direct violation of the commitments that...
He's like, bro, sorry, we can't, you know, we just have to maintain an apartheid because people are fighting against it. Oh, shit, my bad, dude. Fuck. I didn't realize. Dude, there is no world in which this argument, like, factors into the equation when talking about, like the Holocaust. You know what I mean? Can you imagine being like, well, you know, the German government had to set up concentration camps because of all of the resistance from socialist and oftentimes like Jewish socialist resistance groups against the Nazi government. Like, can you imagine making an argument like that? That's fucking insane. It's completely inappropriate. Except I can't imagine it because that is precisely how it was sold to the German public. Yeah, how much of this was the fault of the Bolsheviks? On the rare instance that advocates of the apartheid state of Israel talk about the Tamil genocide in Sri Lanka, here's an easy response. Israel was Sri Lanka's largest weapons supplier for decades, and there are direct war crimes like bombings of Tamil orphanages that were done with Israeli Air Force Kafir jets. Aren't Israeli Air Force just just basically reskinned American jets too? Hey Hasan, are you COVID positive? Hasan, you sound so sick. COVID can disable you for life. What? So did you get this sickness from what? What? It's closer to HIV than flu? Bro, what is happening right now? Did you get it from your interactions or bring it to them? The moon monkey? Dude, take your medication, okay? I'm not even sick. What the fuck? Like, I cleared my throat. There is no cure for long COVID. Sniffling really bad. All right, chatter. I'm gonna ban you. With the hopes that you can maybe fix your brain. Anyway, let's continue.
Leaders of Israel have made in the past at Camp David when I was president and in Oslo, promising that Israel would withdraw from occupied territories. They have failed to do so. In response to that, and I'm not excusing them, there have been acts of violence. As a matter of fact, though, Hamas, the number one accused persons of violence, have not committed an act of suicide bombing that caused an Israeli life now since August of 2004. And I hope that they won't do that anymore. Other participants of the Palestinian society, smaller ones, have committed some atrocities. But the loss of life in the entire occupied territories has been horrendous and has been...
That chatter was awesome. Why did you ban them? Because he was like very deeply mentally ill. Not even because like he's talking about COVID being a massive problem. That part is correct. But deeply mentally ill because he's just like, I cleared my throat after eating food. And then he suspected me of having COVID. Then fantasized about it being a long COVID. Then talked about how I had probably given it to other people. And who I was wondering where I got it from. Like violating numerous parasocial boundaries while also demonstrating hysteria. So it's insane.
But do the Israelis have any alternative when they continue to send these suicide bombers into places that kill women and children not to strike back? I mean, is there any alternative?
There has to be some striking back, but I wrote another book called Talking Peace, and I describe the fact that every conflict, whether it's between a husband and a wife, or a father and a son, or students on a campus, or ultimately between two nations, or between Israelis and Palestinians, is caused by the same thing. It's an element of misunderstanding and animosity and hatred and even violence that has to be recognized as not fruitful. Neither side can prevail. And then stepping back and trusting some intermediary, if necessary, to respect one another long enough to seek peace. And then during the mediation process, which I used at Camp David and still use, every time either side makes a concession, they have to be convinced that what they gain is greater than what they're giving up. And at the end, both sides have to feel that they have won. This was a case with the treaty that still exists. But the biggest step is for the...
Every post about Jimmy Carter is either he secretly taught orphans English for 47 years and never wanted credit, or in 1979 he gave the king of Siam a shipment of rifles to massacre the freedom nuns.